the community yet, you can please reach Matthias, who is the coordinator, and he will be happy to join you, and so you can enjoy all the benefits of this community. So we will have different thematic streams on topics that we hope that will be of your interest, and some will be sharing some, local case studies or approaches or solutions. Other will be remote training. Mm-hmm. So today we are going to start with the first one of the string of impact, learning, gender and media. So very exciting topics. And that has been carefully curated by the GCC team, by Matthias, Alexandra, and Pascal. And of course, by our star speaker, Lisa. Mm-hmm. So we hope that you all enjoy the virtual workshop today. And please, Lisa, we are in your hands.
Okay, thank you, Sandra, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. This is an exciting opportunity and the second one of these that I'm doing in 24 hours. So I'm really excited to see how our discussions will go today. This is an interesting group. If I look at the participant list, we have more women this time, I think. Last night it was more men. So we are achieving gender parity and balance, which is always a good thing. So this morning, we're gonna jump straight in after doing a quick round of introductions, because I don't know everyone on the list, and I'm hoping there are also some new faces. How we propose to do this is to nominate someone, I nominate someone, they nominate someone else, and then we at least do a quick round. Name, organization, and just a little bit about yourself, and then we'll jump straight into the presentation, if that's okay with everyone. So I take the power within me to nominate Pascal Fabi.
All right, hi everybody, Pascal Fabier. I'm leading the development of this community, and I'm based in Norway, working from home like most of us. Over to you, Fabiola. Fabiola, if you want to unmute. Yeah.
Yes, hello everybody. My name is Fabiola Berrocal. I am from Peru and of the Sustainable Landscape Project, JEF project.
Great, thank you. And so you need to nominate someone, Fabiola.
Sorry?
You need to nominate someone else.
Yes, I am a monitoring and evaluation specialist.
Okay.
And I
can go. I can go. That's fine. Well, my name is Matias Ferreira. I'm the coordinator of this community. I know most of you personally. To those who I do not know, you might hear from me after this call. I'm gonna pass it to Pascal Bonson.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Pascal Bonzon, and I am based in Panama. I work for UNDP Green Commodities Program. I'm the Good Growth Partnership Global Project Manager. And actually the findings from Lisa are coming from a global knowledge product that we produced based on the work of a few of our countries under GGP. So it's our flagship knowledge product for 2019 on gender. And looking forward to this hour and a half with all of you. Thank you. I'm passing it on to Lavinia.
Hi everyone, my name is Lavinia Gasperini and I'm from Italy. I'm part of the Panama team. I'm the new junior support consultant for the Green Commodities program. And yeah, like everyone, I'm working from home right now. And I pass it to Alexandra.
Hi everyone, my name is Alexandra. I work for UNDP. I'm with the Green Commodities program. I'm responsible for the program knowledge management side, and within this community, I'm responsible for outreach and quality assurance. And I'm based in Europe, in Portugal currently. And I'll pass it to Stephanie.
Hi, I think I might be the only one not from the UN. I come from the UK. I come originally from Canada, but I'm based in the UK, and I work for Partnerships for Forests, which is largely a commodity program funded by DFID and managed by Palladium, my employer. Yeah, I hope I'm not the only one not from the UN. And I'll pass it on to Aline.
Hi everyone, so my name is Aline da Silva. I'm working with UNDP, but there are other people who are not from the UN. And I'm working on the Good Growth Partnership. I'm the program management support for this project, and I am based in Panama. And I'm passing it to Margaret.
Hello, I am not from the UN. I'm from World Wildlife Fund. I think that's why Aline picked me. So yeah, I manage the demand project in the Good Growth Partnership. And I will pass it to my colleague, Owen.
Hi, everybody. My name is Owen. I work with WFUS in DC, along with Margaret, doing market research for the GGP. I will pass it to Ronald.
Yeah, good day, everyone. Greetings. My name is Ronald. I'm Ronald Cumberbatch, and I'm based in Liberia, and I manage the production part of the project here in Liberia. I think Lise Joseph Sen, and sorry, I can't pronounce it well. I'll pass it on.
We can hear you, Lisa.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So my name is Lise Josefsen Herman. I'm originally from Denmark. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm not from the UN. I'm based in Quito in Ecuador. And from here I cover a great part of Latin American region for media in Europe, especially Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Germany.
Right.
I'm not sure who's still there.
I haven't introduced myself. If I can go.
Sure.
My name is Andrea Aguilar. I am based in Guatemala, and I am a national consultant for stakeholder engagement and gender for a GEF project. And hi.
Hello.
I think it's only Marina missing.
Yes, I think so.
Hello, everyone. I am Marina Guyot. I am from Perforest. I'm based in Brazil, and I work mainly with responsible sourcing projects, and I am the focal point of Perforest in Brazil for gender. Nice to meet you all.
Sorry, thanks, Marina. Thank you, everyone, for those quick introductions. And we're now going to jump into the presentation and also the workshop. So let me start by asking Matthias to put up the presentation, please. Let me know if at any time you're not hearing me well, and I will try to either improve the level of my voice and or slow down. So the focus this morning is on gender and women's empowerment in sustainable commodity supply chains. And as Pascal Bonzon would have noted, this is the result of work that we've done over the last year, looking at both the literature, programs, analyses that have been done across the 3 supply chains that are part of the GGP, mainly beef, soy, and palm oil. As you can imagine, there are varying levels of analysis and available information, but what we've tried to do is to really try to see what are some of the trends and patterns on addressing gender and women's empowerment, what seems to be working, where it seems to be working and how, where we can, and then also looking at some new things that are happening and where there are still some gaps and opportunities to improve. Next slide, please. The focus of the session this morning really is the 4 things: to understand a little bit more about how gender matters and why gender matters in CSCs, to familiarize you with the knowledge product itself, and you'll see a copy of the front page of the product on your right. to socialize a little bit more of the findings from the experiences and good practice, and to also hear from you and to engage with you in terms of whether these resonate, they don't resonate, perhaps there are other things that you've seen in your experiences. And then also at the end, to explore interest in a half-day virtual workshop to go deeper into some of the lessons learned, but also some of the tools we've identified that we think will help those of you who are working directly on gender and those of you who may work on gender and women's empowerment over the next year or more. As you can imagine, in an hour and a half, we cannot necessarily dig deep into all of the issues, but we certainly will try to do as good coverage of the knowledge product as possible, and certainly share with you some of the findings that we have. And hopefully, if there's enough interest, we'll have that workshop later on in the year. I think it's Q3 or Q4 to really dig a little deeper into some of the tools and the methodologies. Next slide, please. So why CSCs? As you can imagine, in 2019, 2020, there are numerous reasons why you want to look at commodity supply chains. We're in a very globalized world where no commodity really has just one unique source or one unique source of production or input. But we also recognize that CSCs are also still very much in deforestation hotspots. Even where they are emerging, we also know that they tend to come along with significant deforestation or resource use. And so this was an opportunity to look at how we could decouple a little bit CSCs from deforestation, but also from issues of exploitation and inequality. We look at the growth of the global middle class, not just growing in numbers, but growing in their importance as important consumers of products, and the amount that they're spending also will make them a very critical component of how and what we produce and for whom. We also recognize from what is available via research, also engagement with different colleagues, that we recognize that women and men don't consume commodities equitably, nor are they involved in the production, demand, and transactions elements and dimensions of CSCs in the same way. But we still recognize that there are also growing trends, particularly for women's spending and women's consumer power, that we also need to consider in terms of how they apply that power. Will that translate into a power that starts to direct certain patterns of production, looking for certain certifications in order for them to flex that power and to talk about the kinds of things they want to invest their money in? And then last but not least, we're also looking at the intersections of gender, race, ethnicity, class, and nationality in terms of access to commodities. So within countries and between countries, there are also dynamics that are happening in terms of where sometimes you see that persons may be producing and contributing to commodities, but actually have less access to those commodities at the end of the supply chain. Others are playing more significant role in terms of demand or even in investment. And so we sought to try to explore some of these elements and to see what that meant for gender and women's empowerment. Next slide, please. So going straight into why gender matters. So when we looked at what was available and the experiences, and that included talking to some of the colleagues here and other colleagues during the Good Growth Conference, we recognize that even though there have been significant efforts in a number of areas across the agriculture sector in general, even in fisheries, sometimes that's seen as part of agriculture, and even in the work on CSCs, that you still see that women are playing an important and valuable role, but often this role is invisible. Sometimes it is invisible because of how we look at the CSCs, and sometimes that's because the roles that they play are seen as more support roles, and also that's because those roles are not valued. And so that issue came up in the discussion yesterday with our colleagues from Asia, and this seems to persist there. We see that also as we look at some of the experiences in Latin America and also in Africa in terms of this invisibility and what that means for their ability to participate effectively and also to influence the way that CSCs are developed and also their sustainability. And what we've seen is that when you ask questions about sustainability, sometimes knowledge is missing, but also there is not an opportunity for them to even engage and understand and to be able to contribute at that level. Then we also recognize that despite the efforts that are ongoing, there still is not always a clear consensus about what gender equality means in commodity supply chains and in different supply chains. And sometimes gender equality is being inconsistently prioritized. And I'll go into a little bit more on that later on. But we also recognize that in a world where we do have more information and we are connected by social media and where information and sometimes scandals can travel very quickly, consumers, customers, and investors are keen to make sure that when they're investing some of their resources, that it has a positive social and environmental impact. So there's an opportunity that is arising more and more, and people are asking more and more questions about the impacts of the products that they're buying and the implications, not just for tomorrow, but for the long term. And also that when we look at the opportunity and we look at the SDGs in the 2030 agenda, and you explore across a number of SDGs, you recognize that if we do a better job of mainstreaming gender and women's empowerment, we could actually contribute at least 9 of the 17 SDGs. And there's a diagram on your right that highlights some of the issues we were able to pull out from the SDG goals and how they match with some of the issues that come up in CSCs. So you look at household food security, you look at unpaid domestic labor, which is still an important issue. You look at decision-making and empowerment, you look at decent workspaces, and you look at non-discrimination and access to training and education, and you recognize that there are really important opportunities that we can maximize via CSCs. Next slide, please. Forgive me, my sinuses are giving me a bit of trouble, but hopefully my voice will sustain itself. Then if you start looking at key gender gaps, what we identified are several that relate to labor. These are not the only areas, but these are some of the most, I guess you would say, sticky ones, and some of the ones where we're struggling more as we start to apply both certification standards and safeguards, etc. Labor tends to jump up quite a lot. And part of that is because of the pre-existing burden of care and unpaid labor that tends to exist in the agricultural sector. And so we've seen examples whereby even where women and children are supporting fathers and husbands or supporting the process, this is not valued and this remains unpaid. And this can have cascading impacts on individuals and households. We look at livelihood opportunities and recognize that sometimes these are very limited. Our scope and our understanding of what livelihoods opportunities should be like perhaps needs to be expanded if we really want to invest in sustainable production and good agricultural growth. And then also you look at access and control to inputs and to resources and how that limits income itself, but also limits their capacity to innovate and to respond to new opportunities for sustainability in CSCs. And on your right, you will see that these are important because they have influences on the economic decision-making of households and women themselves. It has influence on what they buy as well as consumers. And so we recognize that we need to consider women in this, not just as farmers, but also as consumers and as investors. And this was one of the key things that came up from the initial analysis of what we were seeing in the sector. We would like to then move there now, stop there for a little bit and to engage with you on what was just presented, and also to see and to do a quick poll, next slide, on whether some of the issues that were identified, if they matter or relevant to the work that you're doing on CSCs, and then we will have a quick discussion to follow that to just understand what perspectives different colleagues and participants had on these issues as presented. So I think Matthias has put up the poll on the screen. Very quick, you just click. We would like you to select 3 of the most relevant to your context, and then we will call on a couple of people to just share with us why they selected what they selected. And welcome to anyone who joined after we started. I see we now have 19 participants. So welcome also to anyone who joined recently. So I think you have a minute. Unfortunately, we have no prizes for who gets there first, but we appreciate your inputs and we look forward to discussing with you what you thought. Okay, and we have our results. So these tools are great. So interesting results. So we see the top one is women's roles in CSCs are often invisible and undervalued. What seems to come next, or there's a tie, that gender inequality has serious consequences for the sustainability of CSCs, and that consumers are increasingly looking at social and environmental impacts when they purchase supply chain products. Less or so, gender equality lens delivering on 9 of the 70 SDGs, and there is some persons that think that because gender is a hot topic and is in fashion. This is very true as well. So great, thank you for that. Does anyone want to jump in and explain why they picked what they thought and why they picked the 3 that they did? And I'm really keen to hear from someone who thought it was because gender is a hot topic and is in fashion. So I'm just throwing that out there. And then I realized that Nadia may not have had a chance to introduce herself, so we can also give her a chance to do that while persons, colleagues kind of wrap their heads around what they want to say. Nadia, if you want to do that.
Yes, hello everyone.
Hello.
I'm Nadia, and I'm working in the Good Growth Partnership and the Green Commodities Program as Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist.
Great. Thank you very much, Nadia. So does anyone want to jump in? I don't want to call names. I can. About, why they thought gender matters, how it matters, or what they're seeing in their work. Yes?
Yeah, I'm guilty. I'm the one who votes that gender is a hot topic and is in fashion.
Wonderful, Sasha. So tell us why.
And yesterday that I was participating in your presentation also, and you clearly say that actually it's a hot topic. I have a very good friend that she's she's in the fashion world, and she always and she's very feminist and very gender sensitive and everything, and she always told me that fashion is a way of changing minds. She sees that as fashion is changing and is changing in the world of women, and it's a way that women can express themselves better. So it's also little by little, step by step changing our minds. Because if you see how, I mean, the story of Coco Chanel and these kind of things, I mean, we as a women, we have been also limited by fashion. So, and yesterday I was thinking that it's a way of taking advantage of, I hope, of course, I hope that gender is going to be something permanent and it's not just, about fashion. But it's a way of taking advantage of what is going on, globally, that everybody's talking about gender, there are a lot of opportunities. So I think it's our chance to really, put on the table and talk freely about gender and, and take this opportunity. So yeah, I changed my mind after your presentation yesterday. I feel, that I feel brave enough to say that.
Great, absolutely. I mean, it's not a negative thing. So that's good. Thank you. Does anyone else want to share before we move on to the next session? Anyone want to share?
I could just add on to that from a very functional point of view. When it's in fashion, that means there's money flowing to it from donors. And so this is an opportunity that we should take advantage of, and we are, to look into these issues and learn more about them and really dig into why, why the dynamics are at play and what can be done. So yeah, the fact that it's in fashion gives us that opportunity.
Excellent, great. So we'll have more opportunity to discuss even more in the next session. And so we can come back to some of this. So I'm keeping an eye on the time and moving on to the next session. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us and also for sharing both of you on this issue. It's good that the issue of the fashionability of gender, which is, as I said, not a negative necessarily, it's an opportunity that we can also take advantage of. So next slide, please, Matthias. So we're gonna look a little bit more about why gender makes business sense. and recognizing that as we do more and more in this area, and as we see and we have more research, we're recognizing that there are social, environmental, and economic rates of return from investments in not only just women and women's empowerment, but also for improving gender equality. Next slide, please. So when we looked at this issue, we definitely wanted to look at the extent to how things were being framed, and the extent to which there were going to be investments in equity, in terms of making more resources available to those who needed them, as well as if there were links to efficiency arguments, as well, in terms of not only the short and medium, but long term, and then also the extent to which we could actually see greater benefits for all by focusing on these issues. And we did this in the context of looking at the 3 dimensions, production, demand, and transactions. So I will quickly, in this session, just give a quick overview of some of the findings or some of the arguments that are available that can be applied to all 3 of those dimensions. Next slide, please. So so these are just a couple of what we found when we looked at the issue of production, and we know that this is an area where there's been a lot of focus and a lot of investment for the last 20 to 30 years. What we're finding is it's not that that what's happening is not useful, but what we're finding is that where you see the better bang for buck, if you will, is when you have things combined. So for example, it's not just focusing on knowledge gaps or information or training, but it's when you do the knowledge gaps and the access to training together and you combine them that you start to see increased productivity in significant levels and more sustainable ones. Similarly, we've had a lot of debate, not just in CSCs, but in the political life and in other areas where we talk about quotas. And quotas, of course, are not a solution in of themselves, but they do help to move the needle in terms of greater representation and participation of women in specific areas. And what we found again is that when quotas are combined with financial incentives, particularly when you're targeting poor and vulnerable women, if you are understanding why they're not participating, and part of that is about their time, about their care work, about the limited income in the households, and you try to find ways to alleviate those concerns, you tend to then see the changes you want to see in terms of representation in groups and in supply chain activities. And in some research that was done that looked at Indonesia, Peru, I think, and Tanzania, they actually found that when the approach that was taken, combining these 2 on a project that was also looking to conserve trees, they actually were able to see some noticeable differences. So what we find is that yes, things are happening, but what we're finding is that it's the combination of some of the investments that tend to make the greater impact and tend to move us forward more on a more sustainable path to gender equality and to women's empowerment when it comes to production. Next slide, please. In demand, as we mentioned before, we're seeing this increasing demand and interest. So consumers, and there is some research that looked at developing countries and middle income countries. So they looked at China, Brazil, and India, for example. And so they noted, of course, it's a limited survey, but they noted that, from the survey respondents, there were 34% interest in this. So this is definitely an area that's increasing. If you also look at some of the feedback coming from some of the big companies like Unilever, they also are recognizing that their consumers are interested in products that have a more sustainable sourcing, as well as a more sustainable impact. And that is actually driving growth of sustainability brands. And it's also, these brands are actually growing faster than the rest of the companies. So the companies themselves are seeing a benefit from this consumer interest and this consumer demand. We also recognize that in 2019, 2020, women are a significant part of the consumer base, particularly if you're looking at things like household products and as Sandra mentioned, fashion. If you look at the fashion industry, women tend to be the main consumers, and you're talking about billions, if not trillions of dollars. So there's an opportunity there, even within the fashion industry, to even think about how sustainable commodity supply chains can contribute to make sure that products are not only sourced sustainably, but that we have limited or reduced environmental impacts and we have more positive social ones. And that consumer spending is also being more visible as we see across the supply chains as well. And then last but not least, transactions. Next slide. this is I guess you would say probably the, the newest kid on the block in some ways. But there's also a lot of excitement and a lot of growth in this area. And so you're seeing the increase in gender equality funds. And in some cases, if you look at some online networks and sources, you can see funds that range from millions of dollars to billions of dollars. One online tool had at least 50 funds noted. So you can see that there's a lot of momentum. Funds are being developed, they're being assessed. And so there's a lot of momentum happening in the creation of funds that are directly looking at gender equality outputs. You're also seeing the increased representation of women at the board level. And though this can be an issue that's slow, it does tend to have a positive impact, not in all places, but there is research showing that this has a positive impact on performance and also on accountability. And then last but not least, one emerging area that's also really facing an uptick right now in terms of discussion, in terms of research, and in terms of investment is also gender lens investing. And right now, the last time I looked, there was at least $4.6 billion in this, and this is expected to grow. So in the context of transactions, when we're looking at the possibilities and the interest, we were looking at investors and how investors are gonna place their money, what kinds of things they're focusing on, they are looking at this. One of the issues that was raised last night in the Asia call was actually an example of an investor which had insisted that they needed to be more women participating in the plantation, and not just at the worker level, but across the firm, at different levels in management, etc. So these demands are coming, and this is also an opportunity for improving and investing. So again, we take a quick stop here to have a quick breakout session to just discuss which of these are relevant or you're seeing already in your work. Matthias is gonna separate us out into breakout rooms. We're gonna have about 5 minutes, just have a quick chat amongst the group. Probably if there are 19 of us, maybe 4 breakout rooms will be enough. And just to hear from you what you're seeing, what is relevant, and then we'll just come back to the main session. So Matthias, I leave it to you to do the necessary.
Thank you. Yeah, we are pausing for 2 minutes while I create the group. So if you want to grab a cup of water, please do so. Sure. While I take my time to work out the technology. Thank you.
Thank you.
Liza, are they actually gender equality funds that exist that are operated now in our sector?
I didn't find many that are necessarily existing in the CSE sector per se. When I tried to take a look at some of them are still very general, but there is some scope for some of that work to be directed towards CSEs. I think that, and in some ways that makes sense because there are many things driving and gender equality is a topic that's happening across a number of sectors. But I didn't necessarily see one. I mean, what I didn't see a lot of were funds that were both in gender equality and environmental, which I think would be even more suitable to CSCs, so that you would get that no deforestation and no exploitation or gender equality combination. But that doesn't mean that there may not be now and that they could not be. What I saw more of was the gender lens investing. And so I think it was one of the sustainable commodity platforms where they were looking at this issue. It was a hot topic that was happening a lot in their meetings, and there is a lot of engagement on gender lens investing as a pathway for social and environmental change. And that seems to be where more of the work in the commodity sector per se seems to be happening.
Great, thank you.
Sure, you're welcome. So I think we've now got the breakout rooms.
You have received an invitation to join your breakout groups. You can accept it and you will be headed to your group. Thank you. Welcome back.
We are back. Hey, Matthias, there's only one choice about returning to the main session. We should have two buttons, say returning to the session, or I don't know, go for a tea with your group or something.
Yeah, I know.
All right.
I feel you were talking about something.
Right. So
not gonna.
So we're back. So Pascal, if you wanted to finish your point, that could start us back quickly.
That's bilateral with Aline. So
okay, that's fine. So hi everyone, we're back. I hope the discussions went well in your groups. I don't know if anybody wants to quickly share anything before I move on to the next session, but we had a nice, robust discussion in our group about the how to translate some of the momentum we're seeing at the big international company level, also to smaller companies, and also to at the farm or the sectoral level, in communities and in countries. And so this was one of the issues that came up. There was the SDG argument, and we talked about the Global Compact, and I think Pascal mentioned the Global Compact local networks efforts. And so I think this is one of the areas where more work can be done. And I think that whole conversation about not just, well, we target the women in the supply chain, we also need to target the women in the broader society who are customers and consumers and also investors who can also help to mobilize and invest in this kind of change as well. So I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in from the group. Pascal, Nadia, Alexandra, Sandra, very quickly before we move into the next session.
So yeah, I can report back quickly. I was in the group with Lavinia, Andrea, and Fabiola. We've mainly discussed things around production. So mainly the fact that participation of women should be more promoted. There is still a lack of the fact that women are not considered in decision-making processes. And also we've acknowledged that there are many policies already in place. However, implementing them, the implementation either is not equally done everywhere, so it doesn't reach all landscapes. And maybe it's an issue of raising more awareness, but also there is not much monitoring and an evaluation done on the implementation of the good policies that already exist there. So that was the main thing. And we also touched base a bit about the demand side, but I'm not going to take more time because the production one was the prevailing.
Okay, great. Does anyone from any other group want to jump in and quickly share with us? Feel free, particularly if you discuss different elements of production, demand, transactions, or you maybe somebody who looked at transactions specifically.
Marina, Marina, would you like to share a little bit what we talk about? I thought your point of view was very interesting about the role of women.
Yeah, sure. So we have discussed about some challenge that we face to cascade commitments from downstream companies throughout the supply chains, because they are far from production, so it's harder to work with this kind of companies than when the work is with upstream companies. What we have been discussing is to and the other challenge is that mainly gender is not a priority for those companies. Deforestation and human rights in general are more like the key asks from them, but we see opportunities to try to open their eyes and to include something when the ask is about human rights or SDGs or things like that. So we can, even if it's not a ask from the company, or we can try to open this door. And the other thing that we discussed is that in agricultural supply chains and even in fishery, where Sandra has more experiences. Usually the women role is like invisible. So many ways they are not in the supply chain in a direct way, but they are creating the all the necessary conditions for the men to join the supply chain. So they are taking care of the child, they are taking care of the housing, and yeah, this is other thing. And we also discussed that there are other indirect issues, like for example on soy there is a huge problem on logistics with prostitutions and child abuse in the roads. So it's not linked to soy growth, but issue on the supply chain. And yeah, and the other thing that that Sandra told that I think it's really interesting is that usually they in fishery, and I think it's the same in agriculture, it's common to hear that women are more capable to do administrative roles. And this is because they are always there doing their job, you know. And that is important to start to discuss if they want to be in that role, and yeah, things like that.
Thank you, Marina, and your team. I think that was really good in terms of exploring some of the broader work that has to happen alongside some of the investment and the training in terms of the narratives, in terms of shining a light on these roles. As you said quite nicely, that I think the enabling role that women provide for these sectors to operate, the supports they provide are not valued. It's seen as a support role, or it's a lower paid role. And I think that's one of the things that we will be talking a little bit more about in the next session, particularly on bridging the gap between paid and unpaid employment, and also just a better understanding of valuing of work and contribution. And as you say, yes, this happens perhaps a little bit more clearly in fisheries. In the Asia group, we also talk about the fact that usually it's the women preparing the gear, preparing the bait. But usually when you look at an analysis of a value chain, that does not appear in the value chain when it comes to the harvesting side. What often looked at is who goes to get the fish or who goes to get the fisheries product. And so I think that some broader analysis and some unpacking of the supply chain, as you've nicely said, Marina and Sandra, and then also understanding those roles and how they contribute will be an important element. I know that we have the monitoring the time, so unless there is a burning contribution from another group, which they could be, I would propose that we can go to the next session and we can continue the conversation, because it will link into some of these issues that you've raised as well in this session. Anyone? Can we go ahead? Okay, so next slide, please, Matthias. So we're gonna look a little bit more deeply at some of the key findings from the knowledge product. And I'll go in a little bit to some of the issues that came out of the different supply chains and some of the proposed actions that we're making for consideration in terms of how to move forward on gender equality and women's empowerment. Next slide, please. And so before I get into that though, as we've spoken, and we recognize that there are things going on. Unfortunately, as I think most of us recognize, some of the more visible efforts are from some of the bigger firms like your Walmart, your Unilever, your Coca-Cola, your PepsiCo. But what we don't often have is a lot of detail on what some of the smaller companies are doing, and also analyses of what are the impacts of some of these efforts. So I think this is definitely going to be something that needs more investment in terms of understanding what is working and at what level and at what scale. And I think that also came up in the discussions. But we also know that we're seeing a lot more roundtables, a lot more declarations and commitments, looking at different elements. So, more recently, you had the Chinese Sustainable Meat Declaration. You've also got the Cerrado Manifesto, which is being promoted by FAIR and which is gathering some momentum. There are other ones going on there, and there are other efforts. But in some cases, as you've all said, some of these are directly and indirectly looking at the social impact. Sometimes they mention social issues and considerations, which, as you can imagine, is very woolly. But as Marina says, that is the opportunity in which you say, okay, so if you're saying social considerations or human rights, here are some gender-related ones that would be important to consider. But in some cases, they don't always specify gender, but they say social or they say human rights, and that will be where we will have to take the opportunity to bring in that gender equality and gender mainstreaming effort. Hopefully, there will also be some revisions to some of these, as they often can be, and that will be another opportunity to put gender more central to the discussion and to also explain why it will be important to put it more clearly and more distinctly. Next slide, please. And we, so when we looked at the beef supply chain, for example, and this is one sector where we know there's been some ongoing and long-standing engagement or discussion about gender, particularly in Latin America. But we also see some movement and discussion in other parts of the world. What I focused on was production in this case, because of one, the size of the slide, and also our time, and just looking at that issue of unpaid care work and invisibility. And it just builds back on the point that Marina made in terms of how do we start to tackle that. And so some of the things that were proposed based on what we've either seen or what seemed to be delivering on change included focusing, make that gender rights argument in the context of humans, and you want to make sure that we have and promote their participation as part of that human rights discussion. And so one of the things you may want to look at is looking at quotas, and it could be on the farm, but also it could be in the decision making, which was another area that we talked about, and just also looking at that broader supply chain, not just at production, that will then have that by the dual feedback loop to what's happening in production. As we know, not all the changes or the push for change will happen in production itself. Some of that also comes from demand, some of that will come from investment. So those will be areas in which I think we could also make a contribution that would then feed back into production. We can also look at guidelines. I think it's important to be clear about what gender equality means in the context of the supply chain and what specific issues you're trying to respond to. I say that because what we found in some analysis that was done in Asia, for example, when they were looking at the response, the RSPO for palm oil, there were good principles and there were good criteria, but in some cases they were too general, and in some cases there was too much wiggle room for persons who were applying or reporting, and so it meant that you had a lot of inconsistency. So perhaps more clear guidelines on what these things mean and the kinds of things that would be desired would probably also help in terms of addressing some of the gaps that are there. Also, I think it's important to understand even more, particularly at this stage, what are some of the roles of women or potential roles of women across beef supply chains. There are interesting dynamics happening if you look at supply chains in Latin America, if you look at some of the discussions happening around beef and cattle in the US, for example, or in the UK. And sometimes you see more visibility of women when it comes to administration, when it comes to the industry outreach, when it comes to investment. And so these are different levels at which we would need to think about what gender equality and women's empowerment would look like. And even in some of those discussions, sometimes what is seen as differences is explained more as sex discrimination rather than gender equality. And we will need to tackle some of those issues because, of course, those also go back to social norms and gender stereotypes to a certain extent. So even us working in the sector also need to be clear on our language and our narrative. And then that just leads me into the point about just communicating why gender equality and social safeguards are important. And again, it lifts off on that point that was raised by Marina and Sandra, but also by Pascal and by Ronald in our conversation. And I'm sure that happened in other groups about really explaining why it's important and the kinds of benefits we'll have. And it goes back to that point about that multiplier, but also just bringing in that other 50% to help with the productivity, to also help with the sustainability and the viability of the sector. So those are a couple of things that link into that paid care work and invisibility question that I think are things that can be explored for sure in the beef supply chain. Next slide. When we look at soy, and again, Marina touched on a couple of these, what we see in demand is that while you may see some movement on the production side, you see some discussion and conversations, we're not always seeing that offer and that definition of what that would look like and what people would be investing in or purchasing, if you will, in terms of a more I don't know, I call it a gender equality marker, but more socially sustainable soy and more environmentally sustainable soy. So some of the things that we looked at were at the ecosystem level, at the livelihoods level, and at the leadership level. And certainly it will be important, I'm building off of some of the discussions, to look at that issue of decision making, also to look at, excuse me, to look at also key performance indicators of what we would want to see. Is it a certain number of discussions and decisions, a certain number of principles and criteria being used in the supply chain? Is there a certain number of percentage of representation we want to see? Then also, how do you apply those social and environmental safeguards in an effective way and in a tangible way, but also a practical way that could be adopted by actors of different sizes? I think this size question also becomes an important one, and because of the exposure. Obviously, a big international firm has potentially a bigger reputational risk, which is a push factor and a pull factor for them to do certain things. But we also want to be able to engage also with those who are smaller, who may be only national, and how do we link that in to existing policies? In most countries, there is a commitment to gender, there is probably a gender policy. So how do we link it into those and do it in a practical way, and also share that burden of reporting and monitoring? Next slide, please. And on palm oil, I picked out the issue of transactions here, also because this is very topical at the moment, as we look at the broader issues of where the industry is going and how it may become more sustainable, and how to address some of the gaps that have been identified. And so the two things that I highlight here are the wage gap, which are also leading to reduced opportunities for access to finance, which then lead to reduced opportunities for investment and for investment in sustainability. And so to look at the potential for leadership via gender mainstreaming based accountability reporting is an important aspect, not the only one, but it's something that we could think about. And some of the ways that we could approach that would be a self-scoring system, and accountability frameworks, like building off of the Accountability Framework Initiative, which has a similar approach. Could be one way in which you could look at this and how firms are actually adopting and implementing decent work provisions. Another one is really just how you tackle at a more societal level. This was the issue that was raised. CSCs are not separate from the societies they're in. So we can't forget the need to go back to looking at those gender norms and social practices. And there are two things we can look at, and these are not the only ones, but these are two that we can discuss and explore a little bit more. So going back to that gender-based rights and participation, looking at some mapping, and also how do we deal with issues of stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement is critical for how you understand the issue and then how you bring the stakeholders in. Some of that will be in decision making, some of that may be in leadership, but some of that is just participation in a more robust way. And I think a focus on stakeholder engagement and understanding who the stakeholders are and how they can be engaged will be important. Because of course, if we're talking about women, different women have different needs and different opportunities and different challenges. And we want to try to reflect that in terms of how we do our stakeholder engagement. And then another element would be the gender-based education, but also governance. And what kind of incentive mechanisms can we use to accelerate GM action? So we talked about how it being fashionable, being topical, the availability of resources is already an incentive, but we may want to think about other kinds of incentives that may be applicable either at the national level or throughout the supply chain that will also help persons to be more consistent and perhaps to nudge that issue of prioritization, which several of you have raised. How do we get it on, how do we get it to be more of a focus and a priority? Incentives might be a way to also address that particular issue as well. And then next slide. And so looking at these, you will not be surprised that when we looked at where some of the significant priority action areas would be for CSCs, these were the four that we identified as, I guess you would say, a foundation for other things. So looking at that labor market issue and paid and unpaid employment, and I could say here work, and looking at how you can leverage some of the work by the ILO on this particularly, but also whether it's the work that's happening in the Global Compact. Also looking at closing women's gap, the gap, in women's access and control over resources, and some of the work that's happening there, whether you look at it in the coffee supply chain, there are lessons to be learned, as well as the cocoa supply chain. but then you also have mechanisms of which you really also understand what are those gaps and barriers. And you really need to engage with those who are really being left behind on that. Look at closing gaps in access to training and application of inputs. There's some interesting work coming out of Asia directly related to this, but also just some general work on looking at forest governance and natural resource management that's very relevant to CFCs, including working with groups and sometimes working with individuals. I think sometimes what's happened is that we've decided the group is the best mechanism, and sometimes we focus on individuals alone. I think what we're finding is that you need a balance, emphasize, and looking at different ways in which we can do that. I'll stop there and then open it up for questions for Q&A and for greater conversation. And then after that, we will enter into the wrap-up session. Excuse me again while I, with the coughing.
I would like to ask a specific, if you have any specific example.
A lot of direct links to the issues that you raised in the last session, to the kind of finance we have. Sorry, go ahead, Andrea.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, I would like to know if you have any specific example or case study on palm oil production and gender mainstreaming. How has that been done? Or
okay, so the one case study I was able to find that was robust enough was on the RSPO, and it was an analysis that was done by Profundo looking at some plantations in Indonesia, and they looked through looking at the principles and criteria that were part of the so it wasn't all negative, but what they found was that there were some serious gaps happening across a number of areas. So, and these included, low paid, women being concentrated in low paid kind of casual jobs. And this standard does have, not only does it have criteria that are specific to gender, it actually also has a gender working group. But they found that because of some of the necessary generalities or ways of putting this requirement forward, and also in some of the application, and of course, being at the plantation level, that there were gaps that were emerging, and there were significant enough across various plantations for them to raise them. So as I said, it was the concentration of women in low wage casual work. Another one was related to child labor, and some of that might just be because women had to bring their children to the plantation because of a lack of childcare. And so they got involved or were around activities. They also identified limitations on women's collective bargaining for improvements. Another one was occupational health and safety. And in that context, not specifically that study, although that study did mention it, but one of the issues came up around pesticides and pesticide use. And there were two issues. One was that the kinds of pesticides that were being used were identified as probably being particularly harmful to women of childbearing age. But in response to that, what often happened is that women would just be taken out completely of activities or sidelined into activities that were even worse paying, you could say. And so one of the issues there is also about how in trying to address the issue, you don't make the problem worse, I guess would be the best way to say it. And so how do we cope with issues like this, where you're trying to respond positively and effectively to the issue that's arisen, but not there, by doing so, creating other problems. So these are some of the things that were found in some of the efforts that were being made to address gender equality in the palm oil sector. I didn't go through them all, but these are some of them.
I have another question, Raisa, and
Sure.
calling for a short answer.
Sure.
Can you go back to the previous slide, please?
Sure.
In our conversation, in our group work, in which Stephanie was with us, we realized that in most of our projects are 4 to 5 years. So relatively short in terms of time frame in achieving change that can be sustained. In this priority action, is there any recommendation you would make about where do you start? Because it's a tall order to achieve all this into a project that has a short time frame of 4 or 5 years. So are there some of this priority action that carry more potential for change, or is there a starting place, or is it on a case-by-case basis that you need to find your more potent entry point?
So the quick answer to that, Pascal, is yes to all of that, potentially. But I would say that if you were looking at a 4 to 5 year horizon, probably your best bets would be the access to trading and application of inputs, because that has direct relevance to their capacities and understanding of sustainability, their contributions, and also reducing of some environmental and occupational health risk issues. And it could also spur them to have skills that could increase their ability to get different jobs. And then looking at the labor market question, you won't be able to address all of the labor market questions, but if you could narrow they're producing, again, that would change, I think, the narrative and the picture of women in the sector, but then also potentially open up the door for better jobs and opportunities, and also to improve the balance between the unpaid and the paid work. Was that quick?
That's great.
Did that help
that's
in
good.
terms of responding to your question?
Yeah,
okay.
Yes, very helpful. So 3 and 1.
I think, and as you, okay, so yeah, so it's 1 and 3. And I think as you do that, you will start to then also make a contribution to 2 and 4. Because as you do that, you want to bolster those activities by having that role in decision-making and leadership. And as you have those conversations, you will start to see a difference in access and control over resources. The more independence they have, the more agency they have, you will also start to see a contribution to 2 and 4. Any other?
Thank you.
I have another question.
Sure.
You mentioned in the beginning possible impacts on deforestation. There was also mentioned conservation in the beginning, and in the end you mentioned this forest governance. Do you have any recommendations for studies, especially I'm interested in from Latin America?
Well, I think that one of the things that we still are learning about is really just even understanding the different interactions that men and women have with the forest. And with forest products, and even with the use of timber. I mean, I am doing a little bit of work completely different in some ways to this, but not so much in the Gambia. And one of the things that we are having to look at is that interaction between men and women in the forest and forest products. That includes understanding the whole issue of, you know, the food-related aspect, the fodder-related aspect, energy issues, etc. So I think just understanding that, and then understanding what that means for governance, and also what that means for resource sharing, is still going to be a critical aspect, because embedded in all of this, while we're looking at the CSEs, as the resources are being consumed for the supply chain, there will be less resources for people in their other lives. And that can also create some important tensions, and having a governance mechanism and framework for those trade-offs is quite important. In as much as you focus in the supply chain is not operating in a bubble. It's also operating in an area where other things are happening. So when they're not on the plantation, or they're not doing soy, or they're not dealing with the beef, they're still doing other things. And I think that exploring a little bit more of those issues and understanding these resource needs, and then what that means for how the supply chain operates and how that balances with other activities, is still something that we need more information on. And we need more input from the people themselves on as well.
Hello, I have one question. One thing that we have been discussing is that it's hard to find public data about gender, like disaggregated data per country or per sector. So I would ask you if you have any indications of sources. And the other thing is just to let you know that First have produced a series of documents related to soy that called Soy Toolkit. And we have one of these briefing notes is about gender. I will share the link with you. And feedbacks and inputs to that is welcome because we are always reviewing that. And yes, if you have any indications about data sources, would love to know.
Okay, great. So this is going to be our last question. And so I did look at the toolkit, really good because it was short and very useful in terms of where you can start to plug in gender in some of the work that you're doing, etc. And so I think it definitely is something that colleagues should read. Regarding data, yes, this is always a bit of a challenge. Now, of course, the best sources are always the government if it's being collected. The agricultural department sometimes has data, not always up to date, but sometimes they do. What I find is that you need a combination of the available administrative data and some research data. But as I said also last night, what can also be useful is taking a qualitative approach. So that means, engaging with the groups via focus groups and key informant interviews. It won't allow you to crunch percentages, but what it does give you is a landscape, if you will, pardon the pun, of what's happening. You will likely get both, concentrated or agreed activities and some differences, and it allows you to just understand what is happening in the space. But the data question is definitely a big one. Even trying to find good analyses of what's happening in different initiatives or standards was not easy. And so there were always studies that had gone in to look at operationally what happened and looked across a number of actors. So the data question is definitely one that we do need to make some investment in. And it may be something that in terms of the reporting and the labeling that needs to happen, that perhaps that can be an opportunity to improving some of the data availability of what's happening. Certainly, I'm hoping that at a project level, we need to be sure that we are collecting information on a daily basis with workshops, with who we're providing inputs to, and finding ways of using that, because that will also be quite important to understanding some of the gender gaps that are happening at the farm level and at the community level. I've been given a time warning, so I am moving on. So I hope that's responded to your question, Marina, but if I'll also give you some links to what I found as we did the research. So wonderful. Next slide. Great, thank you so much. So next slide. So in the wrap up, I just wanted to quickly say that one of the things that we've included in a toolkit was trying to map through some of what we found and put it into one space, and to look at some of the linkages from the initial problems that we found, next slide, Matthias, to some of the solutions, and then also to some of the examples of positive change that can be achieved. So I looked at some of the initial problems that we saw, looked at how that linked into access and controlling resources, look at some of the things that we need to do in terms of the building blocks, and then looked at some of the potential actions. Small, but I tried to put in as many as I can so you can see different variable types of ways that you can invest in terms of time and resources, and in response to some of the questions that Pascal Fabier raised in terms of whether you look at solidarity networks or capital formulation or property ownership, or whether you look at training and participation, action learning on some levels, or you're looking at quotas and enrollment, or you're looking at deeper issues like workers' rights, which you may not be able to tackle fully in 4 to 5 years, but you can make a start on. And then some of these at the bottom are things that we've observed. So these are things that are there in terms of what people have been able to achieve. This, I hope, will inspire, and that you guys will also be able to help us implement other things, and then we can come back and refine something like this. So very quickly, we just want to make the point to you that we are hoping to have a virtual workshop, and Matthias is going to put up a quick poll to see who might be interested in this half-day virtual workshop that would allow us to go a little bit more into some of the questions you raised that we weren't able to get into, including which steps work, how they work, what kind of tools have been effective, what other initiatives are out there that might be relevant to the work that you're doing that you could perhaps adopt or adapt to your work. And so here's the pool on the screen. And so if you could just let us know if there's interest in that for you or your colleagues in Q3 and Q4 to be able to explore more on the how-tos.
Just Pascal, I want to say something. I think if you're here, it's because you're probably very sensitized already or interested in the issue. So we are preaching to some converted people here. But I think there are some people that work around you that you may have in mind that should be attending your training because you think they have a knowledge gap or a blind spot. We are interested in you thinking of these people too.
Great, excellent.
So that's what I mean. Thank you very much, Liza.
Yes, thank you so much, Pascal. That's a very good point. So
you can multiply out my yes vote for like 10 others at least. For the
wow, fantastic, Margaret. Great. Awesome.
Margaret, can you sign them up?
Exactly.
I will make it mandatory.
Okay, awesome. Great. Thank you so much. So it's 10:31, and I know that you guys have other engagements today. So I take this opportunity to thank you all sincerely for participating. Thanking Pascal and Pascali, Matthias and others for giving me the opportunity to have this engagement with you. Certainly it was exciting for me and I hope it was interesting and engaging for you as well. I look forward to the news about whether we're going to have a follow-up workshop in Q3 or Q4. But thank you so much for your engagement. Really appreciate it. Thank you and have a great day and a great weekend.
Be safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.